People will tell you loyalty is something you owe to whoever is standing closest to you, and for the better part of 12 years, I organized my entire life around that idea, and it cost me a father I didn't get back in any clean or complete way. I was sitting at the plaintiff's table in Denver County District Court, courtroom 14, on the second Tuesday in October, watching an exhibit get marked as Exhibit 22, 9 canceled checks, $6,000 each, made out over 9 consecutive years to a law firm I had hired 8 months earlier, believing I'd found them entirely on my own. Every one of those checks had my father's signature on it. I had spent 12 years choosing my husband over my father, in every disagreement large and small. In every holiday seating chart, in every argument about money, in every moment my father tried gently to tell me something was wrong, and I am not going to soften how deliberate that choosing was. I chose Derek. Every time. On purpose. Knowing what it cost my father to watch me do it. My name is Renee Ostrander. I use my maiden name again now. I'm 44. I live in the Washington Park neighborhood of Denver, and I've spent the last 19 years in residential lending. I'm a branch manager now. I used to be a loan officer, and for a while during my marriage, I was the person who literally processed the paperwork that erased my own father's name from a debt he was owed. I'm going to tell you about that specifically, because it's the part I've had the hardest time saying out loud to anyone who isn't a judge. But let me back up, because none of it will land right if I start there. You need to understand who my father actually was before you understand what it meant that I treated him the way I did, for as long as I did, for reasons that felt completely reasonable to me at the time. I've told parts of this story before, to a therapist, to one close friend who has since heard the whole thing more times than she probably wanted to, and each time I tell it, I notice myself wanting to speed past the middle. The years where I was simply cruel to a good man in ordinary, forgettable increments, and get to the part in the courtroom where I finally understood something. I'm not going to do that here. The middle is the actual story. The courtroom is just where I ran out of room to keep avoiding it. My father, Walter Ostrander, spent 26 years with Denver Fire, the last 11 of them as captain of Station 3 on Spear Boulevard, and he raised me alone starting when I was 9, after my mother died of a brain aneurysm in our kitchen on a Tuesday afternoon while she was unloading groceries. I don't remember very much about her. I remember almost everything about the years after, because it was just the two of us, and my father built a life around making sure I never once felt like I was being raised by a man improvising. He learned to French braid hair from a manual he kept in his glove box. He labeled my school lunches with a joke written on a napkin every single morning, a new one, for years. Bad puns, mostly, the kind that make a 9-year-old groan and a 44-year-old woman would give almost anything to find in a coat pocket now. When he retired from the department at 52, he didn't slow down. He started volunteer coaching youth wrestling at the Eisenhower Recreation Center for free every Tuesday and Thursday night for kids whose fathers weren't around for one reason or another, which I understood even as a teenager was not an accident of scheduling. There's a specific memory I keep returning to from when I was maybe 14, of a woman named Doris Feldman who lived 2 doors down and lost her husband suddenly one February. My father shoveled her walk every morning that entire winter before his shift started, 4:30 in the morning, without ever mentioning it to her directly or to us, and I only found out because I woke up early once for a swim meet and saw him out there under the streetlight with a headlamp on, working in complete silence. When I asked him about it later, he seemed almost embarrassed to be caught, and he told me the trick to helping someone who's grieving is to do it in a way that doesn't require them to perform gratitude back at you. Because gratitude, when you're in that much pain, can feel like one more obligation on a day that already has too many. I didn't think about Doris Feldman again for almost 30 years. I thought about her constantly during the months after that October hearing, because I finally understood that whatever my father had done for me was built out of the exact same instinct, help delivered in a way specifically designed not to be noticed, so the person receiving it would never have to carry the weight of owing him anything back. He had a phrase he used on me constantly, mostly about wrestling, but really about everything, which was that you can't referee your own match, meaning you can be strong, you can be right, and you can still be too far inside a situation to see it clearly. Which is exactly why every match has someone standing outside the circle whose entire job is to see what you can't. I heard him say it probably 100 times growing up, and never once thought about what he meant by it until it was far too late to thank him for building me an entire safety net out of a sentence I'd stopped listening to. Every Sunday, without fail, from the time I moved out for college until the year everything between us went quiet, my father called me at 6 o'clock in the evening. Not 5:45. Not 6:15. 6 o'clock. Like a shift change. We didn't always have much to say. That wasn't the point. The point, I understand now, was the same as a porch light he never had. Because he lived in an apartment after I left home, but if he had owned a house, he'd have left it on. The point was simply that he showed up, on schedule, whether or not there was anything worth showing up for. Money in our house growing up was steady but tight. A captain's salary and a pension he started contributing to at 26. No extravagance, no debt. A man who paid cash for a used truck every 8 or 9 years and considered that a system worth defending. I never once, as a kid, heard him complain about what we didn't have. What I did hear, more than once, usually pointed at me gently and without heat, was some version of the idea that money should never be the thing that decides who you let close to you or who you push away, that you can tell a great deal about a person by watching what they do for the people who can't do anything for them in return. I didn't understand, at 26, standing in his kitchen telling him I was engaged, that I was about to spend the next 12 years failing that particular test, in almost every way it's possible to fail it. My father wasn't perfect, and I don't want to paint him as some saint I simply failed to deserve, because that's its own kind of dishonesty. He could be stubborn to the point of exhaustion. He held grudges against contractors and city bureaucrats with a specificity that bordered on comic. He never remarried after my mother died, and though he told me for years it was because he'd never met anyone worth the trouble, I think the truth was closer to the fact that he'd built his whole identity around being the one steady thing in my life. And he was afraid. On some level, he never said out loud that another person in the house might complicate that. He wasn't a martyr about any of it. He liked his life. He liked his wrestling kids and his Sunday calls and his truck and his coffee exactly the way he made it, too strong, in a percolator he refused to replace. I'm telling you this because the version of him I'm about to fail is a specific, flawed, ordinary man. Not a symbol, and that specificity is what makes what I did to him land the way it should. I met Derek Voss at a mortgage industry mixer in a hotel ballroom off Spear Boulevard, ironically about 6 blocks from my father's old firehouse when I was 25. Derek ran a commercial insurance brokerage his own father had built out of an office in Cherry Creek. And he came from the kind of family that measured a person's worth in the quality of their references. He was charming in a way that photographed well and wore down slowly, the way water wears down stone, and it took me the better part of a decade to notice how much smaller my life had gotten under all that charm, one reasonable sounding request at a time. We married on the 11th of June, And my father walked me down the aisle in a rented tuxedo he'd pressed himself, and gave a toast at the reception that made half the room cry. And Derek's mother told me afterward, not unkindly, but not warmly either, that my father was a real character, which I understood even then was not entirely a compliment. 11 months into the marriage, my father gave us $40,000 toward the down payment on our first house, a bungalow in Park Hill. He didn't call it a gift. He drew up a simple promissory note himself, no interest, repayable whenever we could manage it, because that was how he'd been raised to treat money that mattered. Carefully, on paper. So nobody's memory of the arrangement could quietly drift. Derek hated that note from the day he saw it. He said it made the house feel borrowed instead of ours, that real family doesn't itemize love, and over the following year he brought it up often enough that I started to feel the same irritation about it that he did, the way you can catch someone else's mood, the way you catch a cold. On the 3rd of March, during a refinance, I processed myself at the bank where I worked because I was licensed to originate and because using an in-house employee saved us the closing costs. I structured the new loan in a way that satisfied and closed out my father's promissory note in the county record, folding the $40,000 into our new mortgage without ever formally repaying him or telling him the note itself no longer existed as a separate, documented obligation. On paper, it looked like his gift had simply been absorbed into the refinance, the way any family contribution might be. In practice, I had quietly converted a debt my father expected to eventually be repaid into a gift he never agreed to give, using my own professional authority to do it. And I told myself it was a technicality, a piece of paperwork housekeeping, nothing that changed what we all understood the money to be. My branch manager at the time, a woman named Carol Jennings, who had trained me my first year in the business, flagged the file before it closed. Loan officers aren't supposed to originate loans for their own immediate family without a second set of eyes. It's a compliance issue, and Carol knew my father's name was on that promissory note. "You want me to hand this one to Greg instead?" she asked me, standing in my cubicle with the file still in her hand. "Given whose name is on the note." "It's fine, Carol. It's simple. I've done 100 of these. I'm not worried about the math. I'm asking if you want someone with distance on it." "I have distance on it. He's my father, not a stranger. I know exactly what this is." I signed off on my own file. Carol let it go, because I outranked her by then in seniority if not in title, and because I said the words with enough confidence that objecting further would have looked like she was accusing me of something. I drove home that night and told Derek it was handled, and he said good, now it's really ours, and I remember feeling relieved, like I'd passed some kind of test, instead of understanding that I'd just failed one that mattered infinitely more. My father found out the note was gone almost by accident 8 months later when he asked, gently, the way he asked everything, how the repayment schedule was coming along, expecting maybe a small monthly amount, expecting nothing urgent, just an acknowledgement that the arrangement still existed. This happened at Thanksgiving, at our house, with Derek's parents at the table, and my father asked it so quietly that I don't think anyone but the 4 of us even registered it as a question with weight behind it. I told him, in front of everyone, that the note had been handled in the refinance, which was true and also nothing like an answer, and Derek said, a little too loudly, that he didn't think this was the time or place to talk about money, and my father said, "You're right, I'm sorry," and passed the potatoes, and didn't bring it up again for years. Derek was furious that night after everyone left, not at himself, not at the situation, at my father, for making the whole dinner about money and putting me in a corner. I remember standing in our kitchen at 11 o'clock at night, agreeing with him, actively agreeing, constructing the case against my own father out loud, because it was so much easier than sitting with what I'd actually done to him. We didn't invite my father for Christmas that year. Derek suggested it, and I let the suggestion become a decision without ever actually deciding anything myself, which is its own kind of choosing, the kind that hides inside passivity and still counts. There was another moment, smaller than the Thanksgiving dinner but somehow harder for me to forgive myself for, about 8 months after the refinance closed. Derek's brokerage lost a major client that spring, and for a few weeks our own finances were tighter than they'd let on to anyone, including me, until the numbers forced the conversation. My father called, not knowing any of this, just calling because it was Sunday, 6 o'clock, and somehow, in the course of the call, I let slip that things were a little tight. He didn't ask a single follow-up question about the promissory note, didn't mention the $40,000, didn't bring up anything about the past at all. He simply asked if $1,000 would help get us through the month. No strings, no note this time, nothing to sign. I told Derek about the offer that night, expecting him to be moved by it, and instead he laughed, not cruelly exactly, more dismissively, and said something about how your dad just likes having something to hold over people, and I laughed along with him, actually laughed. At a 70-something-year-old retired firefighter offering his daughter $1,000 with no conditions attached, because agreeing with Derek had become so automatic by then that it happened faster than my own judgment could intervene. I called my father back and told him we were fine, we didn't need it, but thank you. He said okay. He didn't push. He never pushed. My father tried once, about a year after that, to say something bigger to me. Not about the money specifically, but about a pattern he'd started to see. The way Derek monitored my spending on a shared app. The way our friend group had quietly narrowed down to only Derek's friends. The way I'd stopped finishing sentences without checking his face first. My father said it carefully, sitting across from me at a diner on Colfax, no ultimatum in it, just an observation from a man who'd spent 26 years learning to read a room before it burned down. I told him he'd never liked Derek, not from day one, and that I was tired of him always finding some reason to make my marriage the problem. He didn't argue with me. He just nodded, paid for both our coffees, and drove home, and I remember watching his truck pull out of the lot and feeling, underneath the anger, something that felt almost like relief. The relief of a door closing on a conversation I didn't want to keep having with myself. For the next 8 years, my father and I existed in what I can only describe as a permanent low hum of distance. The kind that doesn't announce itself as a rupture because there's no single explosive fight to point to, just a long, slow retreat dressed up as busyness. He still called every Sunday at 6 o'clock for the first 2 of those years. I let it go to voicemail more often than I answered, and eventually the calls thinned out to once a month, then to birthdays and holidays. And I told myself that was normal, that adult children drift from their parents all the time, that this was simply what a marriage in full swing looked like from the outside. I made branch manager in year 5, the youngest one in our region, and Derek framed it at every dinner party as evidence that we'd built something together, that once I'd stopped letting outside noise distract me. My career had finally taken off the way it was supposed to. I believed a version of that story myself, privately, for longer than I'm proud of. I told myself the quiet with my father was the price of a stable life, the way you might tell yourself a demanding job is worth the hours it costs you, and for a long time the math seemed to work, because I couldn't see the side of the ledger that was accumulating somewhere I wasn't looking. For 3 winters in a row, I didn't see my father at all, outside of a single obligatory Christmas Eve visit that rarely lasted longer than 90 minutes. In year 6, he had a minor cardiac procedure, a stent, nothing catastrophic, but not nothing either, and I found out about it 11 days after the fact, secondhand, from Ruben Castillo, the assistant coach at his wrestling program, who mentioned it in passing at a fundraiser I only attended because a client of mine had a son on the team. I remember standing there with a paper plate of cookies in my hand, doing the math on 11 days, and feeling something crack open in my chest for about 4 seconds before I closed it back up and told Ruben that yes, my dad mentioned something about that. Everything was fine now. Thank you for asking. I did not call my father that night. I told myself I would call him that weekend, when I had more time to really talk, and I did not call him that weekend either. In year 7, on Father's Day, I sat in my car outside a grocery store for 11 minutes with his number pulled up on my phone, my thumb over the call button, rehearsing an opening line, and Derek texted me twice asking where I was with the groceries. And I put the phone down and went inside. I've thought about those 11 minutes more than almost any other single stretch of time in my adult life, more, honestly, than I've thought about entire years of my own marriage. I wasn't stopped by anything dramatic. I was stopped by the small, stupid gravitational pull of not wanting to be late, of not wanting to explain a phone call I'd have to explain, of choosing the frictionless thing over the necessary one, the way I'd been choosing it for years by then, without ever framing it to myself as a choice at all. I remember one specific evening in year 5, not long after I made branch manager, when I mentioned offhand that I wanted to invite my father to the small firm dinner celebrating the promotion. Derek didn't say no directly. He never said no directly to anything. That was part of how it worked. He said, of course, if you want the whole night to turn into a thing. And left the sentence there for me to finish myself, and I finished it the way I'd learned to finish all of his half-sentences by then. By deciding on my own not to invite my own father to the biggest professional milestone of my career. And then telling myself, afterward, that it had been my decision, made freely, for reasons that had nothing to do with him. Derek's control, in that stretch of years, never arrived as anything a stranger could point to and call abuse, and I want to be honest about that instead of reaching for a tidier story. It arrived as 1,000 small adjustments, a shared budgeting app that flagged any purchase over $100 for discussion. A running joke about my father's truck and his fire department manners that I laughed along with at dinner parties full of Derek's friends. A slow erosion of my own friendships that I mistook, for years, for simply growing up and growing apart from people. I built an entire professional identity in those years that looked, from a distance, like success, promotions, a corner office with a view of the Front Range. A reputation in my industry for being unshakable under pressure. And I privately credited almost all of it to having handled the family drama, to having finally chosen the version of my life that didn't require managing my father's feelings alongside everyone else's. It never once occurred to me, in real time, that the stability I was so proud of had a foundation made partly out of a man I was systematically erasing from my own life, one missed Sunday at a time. In year 9, Ruben Castillo called me directly, the only time in all those years he ever did, to ask, carefully, whether everything was all right between my father and me, because Walter had started showing up to practice a few minutes later than usual on Thursdays, which for a man who'd run a firehouse on a schedule tight enough to save lives, Ruben said, was as close to an alarm bell as he was ever going to sound. I told Ruben everything was fine. We were just both busy. And I got off the phone and sat with my hand on the receiver for a long time, and then I did not call my father. And I did not ask myself why a man who had never once been late to anything in his life had started arriving a few minutes late to the one commitment he cared about most. I understand now, in a way I couldn't let myself understand then. That a person who has quietly given up on being reached back sometimes stops rushing toward the thing that used to structure their whole week because there's no longer a phone call waiting on the other side of it that might have come while they were driving. The marriage ended in year 11, though I didn't understand until year 12 exactly how it had actually ended or when. I found out about the affair from a bank statement of my own, an account I still had access to. A hotel charge in Vail on a weekend Derek told me he'd spent in Chicago for work. $412 at a property I'd stayed at with him exactly once, for our 5th anniversary. When I confronted him, he didn't deny it so much as reframe it. Told me I'd checked out of this marriage years ago in every way that mattered. Which was, I'll admit now, not entirely untrue, even if it wasn't the defense he thought it was. What followed wasn't a clean separation. Derek had been quietly moving money for at least 2 years, a consulting retainer paid to a friend's shell company, a life insurance policy he'd let lapse without telling me, business assets he'd undervalued on paper, and I went from being a branch manager who understood credit files better than almost anyone in the state to being, for the first time in my adult life, the person on the wrong side of a financial investigation. A colleague from my industry, not a close friend, recommended a divorce attorney named Diane Kessler, who had a reputation in Denver for being the person you hired when the other side had something to hide. I called her office in February, expecting a consultation fee and a waiting list. Instead, her assistant told me Miss Kessler could see me the following morning, that there was, in her words, already a file open under my name, which I assumed at the time was simply an intake formality, the kind of thing law offices do when they're organized. I didn't think about it again for 8 months. The hearing where I learned otherwise wasn't the final divorce decree. It was a motion hearing in October on temporary spousal support and attorney's fees, courtroom 14, in front of a judge named Alvarez who ran her docket with almost no wasted motion. Derek's attorney, a sharp, unhurried man named Preston Hale, was arguing that I had access to undisclosed financial resources, and as part of that argument, he'd subpoenaed Diane's trust account records, a fairly aggressive, fairly common move in a contentious support fight, meant to suggest I wasn't as financially strained as I claimed. His paralegal handed a binder to the clerk. The clerk marked it Exhibit 22. Diane stood up before Judge Alvarez could rule on admissibility and said she had no objection to the exhibit being entered, which surprised me because Diane didn't usually let anything into evidence without a fight first. Your Honor, Preston Hale said, flipping to a tabbed page, Exhibit 22 shows a pattern of standing payments into the Kessler firm's trust account. Going back 9 years, well before this litigation, well before, as far as we can tell, this marriage showed any signs of trouble. We'd ask the court to consider what that suggests about Miss Ostrander's financial picture. Judge Alvarez looked at the exhibit, then at Diane. Miss Kessler, do you want to address this? I do, Your Honor. Diane turned partly toward me before she spoke again, which I remember noticing even in the moment, a small courtesy that felt like a warning. The payments in Exhibit 22 are not from Miss Ostrander, they're from her father, Walter Ostrander. He opened a retainer file with my office 9 years ago, March of that year to be specific, and has renewed it with an annual payment every March since. $6,000 a year. The arrangement was that my office would maintain the file, keep his daughter's name associated with it in case it was ever needed, and provide him a brief update each December, confirming the file remained open. Miss Ostrander did not know this arrangement existed until this litigation required us to disclose it. I want to tell you I said something in that moment. I didn't. I sat perfectly still at the plaintiff's table with my hands flat on a legal pad I hadn't written anything on in 20 minutes, doing the arithmetic before I let myself feel anything about it. 9 years. $6,000, $54,000 total. Starting the March before my wedding in June, my father had opened a file for a divorce he had no way of knowing I would ever need, 3 months before he walked me down the aisle, and had quietly kept it alive at his own expense, through every Christmas I hadn't invited him to, through every Sunday call I'd let ring out, through 8 years of a daughter who had made her choice, over and over, and made it against him. "Your Honor," Preston Hale said, a little less sure of himself now than he'd been 30 seconds earlier, "we'd ask that the court disregard the source as irrelevant to the underlying. I've seen enough on this exhibit," Judge Alvarez said, and moved on to the next motion, and the hearing continued around me for another 40 minutes about temporary support figures and a car that needed to be appraised, and I have almost no memory of any of it, because I was still sitting in March of a year that had happened 9 years earlier, in a version of my life where my father had already understood something about my marriage that it would take me a decade and a courtroom to understand myself. Diane found me in the hallway afterward, by the elevators, and I asked her, flatly, whether she'd known this whole time and just never told me. "I offered to tell you, twice," she said. "He asked me not to. Both times. He said, if you ever needed the file, you'd need it without the weight of knowing he'd been the one holding it open. He didn't want it to feel like a debt. He wanted it to feel like it was just there, the way a hospital is just there, whether or not you ever need to go." 9 years, I said, because it was the only sentence I could locate. "Since before the wedding," Diane said. "He came in alone. I remember it because it's unusual. Most people open a file like this after there's already a problem. He told me he just wanted his daughter to never be in a room like this one without someone in her corner who wasn't afraid of the other side." I asked her why he'd picked her specifically out of every divorce attorney in the city 3 months before I'd even said yes to a wedding date, and Diane told me that was the part she still thought about herself. Sometimes. He hadn't asked her for a reputation or a track record. He'd asked around the fire department for the name of the toughest attorney anyone had ever seen cross-examine a hostile witness, because in his experience, 26 years of pulling people out of the worst rooms of their lives, the thing that mattered most wasn't sympathy. It was somebody who wouldn't flinch. He'd told Diane, in that very first meeting, that he didn't know anything yet about the man his daughter was going to marry, and that he hoped he'd never need to call her, and that if he was wrong about all of it, he wanted to have already done the one thing a father could do quietly, without anyone's permission, before it became necessary. I stood by that elevator bank for a long time after Diane went back inside, long enough that a court officer asked if I needed anything, and I told him no, I just needed a minute. Which was true in a way that had nothing to do with elevators. Judge Alvarez ultimately ruled on the support motion the following week in a written order that had nothing at all to do with my father, a straightforward calculation based on both our incomes and the length of the marriage, entirely unremarkable as far as these things go. I want to be clear about that, because it matters to the kind of story this is. Nobody in that courtroom did me any favors because of what my father had done. Preston Hale's argument about undisclosed resources went nowhere, not because the judge was moved by a father's devotion, but because $6,000 a year in a lawyer's trust account, funded by a third party for a purpose that had nothing to do with hiding marital assets, simply wasn't relevant to the math the court was required to do. I didn't walk out of that building with a windfall or a victory lap. I walked out with the same modest, hard-fought support order I would have gotten regardless, and with an entirely different understanding of the 12 years that had led me there, which turned out to be the only thing about that day that actually changed my life. I drove to my father's apartment that same evening instead of going home, which by then meant a 2-bedroom I was renting alone in Congress Park, because home hadn't meant Derek's house in months. I sat in my car outside my father's building for a long time before I went up, longer than the 11 minutes outside the grocery store all those years earlier, except this time I wasn't stopped by anything except the size of what I owed him and my own uncertainty about whether an apology that arrived this late could possibly be worth anything to the person receiving it. I started thinking, sitting there, about the napkins. I hadn't thought about them in years, the jokes he used to write on my lunch bag every morning, a new one every single day for the better part of a decade, and I realized I couldn't remember a single one specifically. Not one, even though I must have read hundreds of them, because I'd never once thought to keep any of them, and he'd never once asked me to. I thought about the phrase he used to say about wrestling, about not being able to referee your own match, and understood, finally, sitting in a parked car outside his apartment building at 44 years old, that he hadn't been talking about wrestling at all. Not really. He'd been trying to tell a 9-year-old, and then a 19-year-old, and then a 26-year-old standing in his kitchen announcing an engagement, that everyone eventually finds themselves in a match they can't call fairly from the inside, and that the whole point of loving someone is making sure they have a referee waiting outside the circle when that day comes, whether or not they ever call on you to admit they need one. I thought about the Sunday calls, 6 o'clock exactly, and did the math on how many of them I'd let go to voicemail, and stopped doing that particular math because it wasn't a number I could sit with in a parked car by myself. What I had told myself, for 12 years, was a story with real logic inside it, that my father didn't understand Derek, that he was old-fashioned about money in a way that created friction rather than protected anyone, that keeping the peace in my marriage required a certain amount of distance from a man who made things complicated, that I was simply an adult building a separate life the way adults are supposed to. Every piece of that story had just enough truth in it to survive scrutiny for over a decade. What it left out, what I had built an entire adult identity around not looking at directly, was that the distance was never mutual. He never once stopped calling because he wanted to. He never once let his name come off my life the way I'd let mine drift off his. I had spent over a decade mistaking his patience for absence. I thought, too, about the version of this story I would have told myself even a year earlier, if someone had described it to me about another family instead of my own, a father quietly funding a safety net for a daughter who'd shut him out, never asking for credit, never using it as leverage. I would have called that man a saint, the way people do about parents in stories like this. And I understand now that calling him a saint would have been its own way of not looking at him directly, the same way I'd failed to look at him directly for 12 years, just from a different angle. He wasn't a saint. He was a man who'd made a decision in a lawyer's office on a Tuesday afternoon and then simply kept making it, year after year, long after it would have been reasonable, even forgivable, to stop. Sainthood implies it cost him nothing. It cost him $54,000 he could have used on himself, a new truck he kept putting off buying, a roof he patched 3 separate summers instead of replacing, and it cost him 9 years of writing a March check to a daughter's future he had no evidence would ever include him in it, and it cost him, I think, some private, unspoken grief every single time he signed that check without picking up the phone to tell me why. I went upstairs. He opened the door in a Denver Fire Department sweatshirt he'd owned since before I could remember, and he didn't look surprised to see me, which somehow made it worse, like he'd been ready for this exact conversation for 9 years and simply waiting for me to be the one to start it. "You heard," he said. "Not a question. Today, in court. I told Diane not to say anything unless it mattered. It mattered 9 years ago, Dad. It mattered whenever you needed it. That's the only day it had to matter. I stood in his doorway and asked him the only question I actually wanted the answer to. Why didn't you just tell me? Any of those years. Any Christmas I didn't invite you to. You could have said something. Would you have let me help back then? He said. Be honest with me. If I'd called you up in year 4 and said I want to pay for a lawyer in case your marriage falls apart, would you have heard that as love? Or would you have heard it as me being right about him and hated me for saying it out loud? I didn't answer him because we both already knew the answer, and making him say it out loud felt like one more thing I didn't have the right to ask of him. I wasn't trying to be a hero about it, he said. I wasn't sitting up nights proud of myself for some secret plan. I just didn't want you to ever be standing in a courtroom with nobody in your corner. That's not a big thing, Renee, that's just what a father does. I don't need a medal for doing what a father does. I chose him. Over and over. I chose him over you, and you kept paying for a lawyer for me anyway. I know what you chose, he said, and his voice wasn't cold when he said it, which somehow landed harder than if it had been. I watched you choose it. I'm not going to pretend 12 years didn't happen just because we're standing here now. I asked him if I could come in. He said not tonight. Not because he was punishing me, he told me that directly, standing in the doorway, that this wasn't about punishment, but because he needed a minute himself, after 9 years of holding something like this without anyone to say it out loud to. And he thought I probably did too. He said we could talk on Sunday. He said it like it was the most obvious scheduling decision in the world, and it took me a second to understand what he meant by it, and when I did, I had to look away from him for a moment so he wouldn't watch me fall apart in his hallway. 6 o'clock, he said. Like always. I drove home that night the long way, through Park Hill, past the bungalow that used to be ours, and was, as of that October, entirely mine, and I found myself doing something I hadn't done in years, running back through specific arguments with Derek in my head, not to relitigate them, but to notice, for the first time, how many of them had my father somewhere in the wreckage. Mentioned in passing, dismissed in a sentence, absent from a guest list. I counted at least a dozen without trying very hard, spread across 12 years, each one small enough on its own to seem forgettable, and I understood, driving through my old neighborhood at 11 o'clock at night, that a marriage doesn't usually fail because of one large betrayal. It fails the way I'd failed my father, in a dozen small, deniable increments, each one easy to justify in isolation, until one day you look up and the sum of them has quietly become the whole shape of your life. I did not get a clean ending out of any of this, and I want to be honest about that too, because I think it matters more than the parts that resolved neatly. The divorce settled 4 months later. I kept the house in Park Hill after buying out Derek's equity, which took every dollar of savings I had, and a loan I qualified for entirely on my own income, no help from anyone, which felt important to insist on at the time and still does. I never let my father put a cent toward the settlement, the buyout, or anything connected to the divorce itself, even when he offered. Twice, gently, the way he offered everything. I told him the $54,000 he'd already spent on 9 years of a retainer I never asked for was more than enough, more than I'd earned from him in any accounting that mattered, and that the least I could do, the actual least, was handle the rest of it myself. He didn't argue with me about that. I think some part of him understood I needed to prove something to myself that had nothing to do with money. I also went back a few weeks after the divorce settled and found Carol Jennings, who'd left our old branch by then for a competitor across town, and I told her the whole story, the refinance, the note, the 9 years I hadn't known about, mostly because I owed her an apology she'd never asked for. She'd been right to question the file all those years earlier, and I'd been wrong to make her feel foolish for asking. Carol listened to the whole thing without much comment, and at the end she just said that she'd always figured something like that would eventually catch up with me, not because she wished it on me, but because she'd learned, over 20 years in this business, that the paperwork always remembers what the people involved would rather forget. I think about that a lot now, in a job where my entire professional life is built on the idea that the record is the record, that intentions don't matter once something's been filed with the county. I think about how it took a father who never filed anything dramatic at all, who simply kept a quiet, patient account with a lawyer for 9 straight years, to teach me that the record isn't only the thing you can subpoena, sometimes it's the thing somebody kept anyway, on your behalf, without ever asking you to see it. The Sunday calls started again in November 6 o'clock, and for the first few months they were careful in a way they'd never been careful when I was young, shorter, more deliberate. Both of us picking our way across a floor we weren't sure would hold. I asked him, on maybe the 4th or 5th call, whether he was ever going to stop being angry with me, and he said something I've thought about almost every day since, that he wasn't angry, that anger was never really the problem, that what he'd had to sit with for 12 years was closer to grief. Grieving a daughter who was still alive and still, technically his, but who he'd had to watch, choose, again and again, to make herself a stranger to him. He said forgiveness wasn't the hard part. The hard part was learning to trust the 6 o'clock call again, learning not to brace himself every single Sunday for the year it might stop for good. He set his own terms for what came next, and I want to be clear that I didn't get to negotiate most of them, because I understood, finally, that I'd used up whatever right I might once have had to negotiate the terms of his trust. He told me he'd rebuild things with me, but slowly, at a pace that had nothing to do with how urgently I wanted to feel forgiven. He asked me to come to the rec center on a Thursday night, not for a conversation, just to sit in the bleachers and watch practice, the way I used to as a kid before I decided I'd outgrown it. He didn't want a grand gesture. He specifically didn't want one. He told me, almost sternly, that if I showed up with flowers or a speech he'd politely ask me to leave and try again, another week. Because grand gestures are for people who want credit, and what he wanted from me instead was something much smaller and much harder to fake, showing up, on a Thursday, for no reason except that it was Thursday. And that was where he'd be. So I went. I sat in the 3rd row of a set of aluminum bleachers that hadn't changed since I was 12 years old. And I watched a 71-year-old man in a whistle and a windbreaker teach an 8-year-old how to sprawl out of a single-leg takedown, patient in exactly the way he'd always been patient. And I understood, watching him, that I was looking at the same discipline that had funded a law firm retainer for 9 years without ever asking for a thank you. The same willingness to do the unglamorous, unwitnessed work of showing up for someone whether or not they were paying attention. He introduced me to a few of the kids on the team that first night, almost formally, the way you'd introduce a new assistant coach rather than a daughter, and I understood that too was intentional. He wasn't going to hand me back the role of family in front of an audience before he was ready to mean it. One of the boys, maybe 10 years old, asked me if I used to wrestle too, and my father answered for me before I could said, "She used to sit right where you're sitting and do her homework instead," which was true, and which he said without any edge in it at all, just an old fact offered plainly, the way you'd mention the weather. I started coming most Thursdays after that. Some weeks I sat in the bleachers for 2 hours and we barely spoke beyond hello. He told me once that the sitting was the point. I didn't need to earn my way back into conversation. I needed to earn my way back into being someone he could count on being there, and conversation would follow whenever it followed. It took the better part of a year before he let me help him with anything again, and the first thing he let me help with was small on purpose, his taxes, which he'd always done himself, but which had gotten harder to keep straight since the pension paperwork changed, and even then he made me promise I'd sit next to him while we did it, instead of just taking the folder and handling it myself the way I would have once, back when handling things quietly and without anyone's input was the only kind of help I knew how to offer. I started writing him notes again too, small ones, tucked into a card on his birthday, and then, eventually, into his coat pocket before he left my house after Sunday dinner. Not jokes, not at first. I didn't have his gift for that, but short and specific. The kind of thing you write when you finally understood that the size of a gesture was never the point his whole life had been trying to teach you. 6 months ago, on his 73rd birthday, I gave him a framed napkin, not one of the originals, since I'd kept none of those, but a new one I'd written myself, with a joke on it that wasn't very good. The kind he'd have groaned at and kept anyway. He laughed longer than the joke deserved. Then, he put it on his refrigerator, next to a photo of my mother, and it's still there. Ruben, the assistant coach, told me, months later, over coffee after a practice, that my father had never once, in 9 years, mentioned the retainer to him either, even though the two of them talked most Thursday nights about nearly everything else in their lives. Ruben found out the same day I did, from a mutual friend who'd heard about the hearing secondhand, and he said it explained something he'd never been able to put words to. A particular quality my father had of being the calmest man in any room that was falling apart. The kind of calm Ruben had always assumed came from 26 years of running into burning buildings, and which he now understood also came, at least partly, from a man who had already made peace, years earlier, with paying a price nobody around him would ever know about. I asked Ruben if he thought my father had done it because he expected the marriage to fail. Ruben said no. He thought my father had done it because he loved me enough to prepare for the version of my life he hoped would never happen, which is a different thing entirely and a harder thing to do, because it asks you to spend real money and real years on a future you're actively rooting against. There was a version of this story where I use what happened in that courtroom to build a better relationship with Derek's replacement in my life, some redemptive next chapter, a healthier marriage, proof that I'd learned the lesson cleanly enough to apply it somewhere new. That's not what happened, at least not yet, and I've stopped assuming it needs to happen for any of this to have mattered. Most Thursdays, it's still just me and my father and a gymnasium full of other people's kids learning how to fall down safely, which turns out to be most of what wrestling actually teaches, more than winning ever is. How to hit the mat without hurting yourself. How to get back up in time for the next thing. I think about that a lot now, watching him teach it to 8-year-olds who have no idea yet what any of it will end up meaning to them, the way I had no idea, for most of my life, what he was actually teaching me. Some Thursdays I catch myself doing the math again anyway, the same arithmetic I did in that courtroom without meaning to. 9 years, $6,000, $54,000. A March check written for a wedding he hadn't yet watched me walk into. It's not guilt, exactly, or not only guilt. It's closer to the specific ache of understanding, all at once and years too late, the actual size of something you spent a decade treating as small. I'm not going to tell you we're all the way back to where we started, because I don't think there is a where we started to get back to. The 12-year-old daughter he raised and the 44-year-old woman sitting on those bleachers are not the same person, and neither, honestly, is he. What we have now is something closer to a relationship being rebuilt with the studs exposed, where both of us can see exactly what it's made of instead of the version I grew up inside. Where his steadiness was so constant, I never had to look at it directly or understand what it cost him to maintain. That's not a worse foundation. It's just a slower, more honest one, and some weeks it still feels fragile in a way I don't know that it will ever stop feeling. Because trust, once you've spent 12 years proving you'll spend it carelessly, doesn't come back at the speed you'd like it to. It comes back at the speed the person you hurt needs it to, and you don't get a vote in that pace. You only get to keep showing up on Thursdays. If there's a single thing I'd want someone else to take from this, it's that the people who love you best rarely announce it in the moment you're too busy to notice them. They just keep showing up, on schedule, long after you've given them every reason to stop, and they let you find out what that costs them on your own timeline instead of theirs. Trust doesn't come back because you finally understand what you did. It comes back slowly, on Thursdays, in bleachers, whether or not you ever feel like you've earned it yet. If this story moved you, join our community by hitting that like button and subscribing for more honest, family-centered stories.